Hi guys, Nick Thomas here. Welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. And on this episode we're talking about the new Black Fencer Steel Generation training swords. Now Black Fencer, really well known within the HEMA community for making synthetic training swords. That's plastic or nylon training swords. We've got a couple of hundred, actually about 250 upwards in the club of those, and they've been fantastic. And they've, over the last year, started developing a steel range that started with long swords, and I've previously talked about that and shown that, and more recently moved on to doing military sabers. And we were involved, me personally, with getting this product developed with them. I don't have any affiliation with them commercially, but I regularly talk with Black Fencer and the guys that work and run it about getting these products developed and based on originals, and I help them with development without being involved in the business whatsoever. So I've got no commercial interest there, but I get some prototypes, I do testing, and I give them advice and things like that along the way. Now, getting a steel stirrup hilt Infantry Saber made is something very close to my heart, and that's because, as anybody who watches this channel knows, it's one of the primary things that I do in HEMA. I do practice other styles, but British military swordsmanship of the Napoleonic era is one of my primaries. And it's something, some area that's been really lacking in training swords for a very long time. So when Black Fencer started developing their synthetic range, that was a real boon for us, because it gave us, for the first time, a commercially available and affordable and quite safe training sword to use for British military saber of this era. And I worked with them to develop through to the current version 5 based on antique swords that I own and others that I've handled, so that now is as close to a variety of original examples as it could possibly be. And I've done exactly the same with the steel saber, and it's based on what I learned along the way, not just from antiques but from training swords, because I bought and had lots of customs made of this kind of sword over the last 8 years or so. Right, so let's get on to it. Over the last few months, you've occasionally seen this one show up, so I'll talk about this one first. This is the Black Fencer prototype they made, so this was the first one they ever made. It's a bit rough around the edges, and it's never been able to be shown on film before because they wanted to keep the project top secret, but I can now show it because it's all public. And it is rough around the edges. It was a quick throw together to try the concept out. But the fascinating thing is, once they sent it to me, it became my default training saber immediately, because it is that good. I'm not saying this without fault, because I can always find fault with any sword. There is no perfect sword, but it is really nice. So I've got training sabers of this type from various other suppliers like Wojciech Szanek, from Damien Tycho, from Balefire and Swordsmithy, and a few others. And ball hilt sabers of various other manufacturers like Regeni, for example, and Kviken. So I've got a lot of experience with sabers of this type and others, and immediately it was my go-to saber. Now, why is that? Well, getting a stirrup hilt saber like this working well is actually kind of difficult, in part because the blade profile is so wide, and normally if you have a blade profile this wide, you can end up with something that feels quite blade heavy and quite sluggish. And they've overcome that by having a very wide, very deep fuller, which goes pretty much to the tips, the last few, sort of about the last centimetre and a half to the tip. So they've managed to keep the really wide profile, which is really typical and sort of iconic of the period, that late 18th, early 19th century British sabre, based on the sort of Hungarian, Polish and Austrian stuff. So it's really iconic shape, and they managed to maintain that width by giving this fuller, wide, deep, and to the tip, so it's just done everything, okay? And that's really nice. Incidentally, that's the way spadroons normally are, but that's a different story. But, okay, so this one, they call it the 1796 Infantry Saber. There technically was never a 1796 Infantry Saber, but there wasn't a regulation for sabers at the time. So in 1799, the army just said, well, some officers are carrying sabers, we'll allow it under regulation without saying what that saber should look like. So in 1799, they just accepted that it was happening anyway with certain officers, flank officers and things like that. And they just said, okay, 1799, certain officers are allowed to carry sabers, without stipulating what they were. So they followed roughly the 1796 light cavalry pattern, but they usually were a little bit lighter and had a few other subtle differences, usually just a bit shorter and a bit lighter. So that's what this is. It is Infantry Saber based on the 1796 Light Cavalry, but it is not a pattern saber. There was not a pattern for it. And so this is designed to be sort of generic. It sort of generically represents a range of British military sabres that were in use at the time for infantry. And to some degree it might represent some of the smaller light cavalry officers' swords as well, because cavalry officers' swords could vary immensely. They weren't necessarily exactly like the troopers' swords. They could be. Sometimes they were exactly the same in terms of handling characteristics, but they could be a bit heavier, and they were frequently a good bit lighter and sometimes shorter. So to some degree this represents some light cavalry officers' swords as well. But what it's really intended to do is represent the non-pattern and non-regulation infantry sabres from the late 18th century onwards. And a lot of regimental patterns looked very similar to this as well. Okay, and on this prototype it looks a lot like a light cav because it's got the classic stirrup hilt of the light cav. It's also got the back strap and the ears, which the reason for that to be on there on the original is exactly why it's here actually, is that you've got basically a rivet going through the tang. So it's not just held down by the peen, it's actually riveted through the tang, which means it's constructed both like a sword and a knife all at the same time, which does make it very, very strong. Anyway, so this was the prototype. It came in around 730 grams, which is in my ideal specification. The balance is 14 centimeters. Again, that was within my specification. It's 80 centimeters long, which is exactly the same as the synthetic that they make. So realistically, compared to the synthetic, this is very, very close. The only real difference is the blade is just a little bit heavier, and that brings the balance a little bit further forward. The synthetic V5 is 12.5 centimeters balanced, and this is 14. So that extra 30 grams is primarily in the blade, so you've got a little bit more blade presence. In many ways, that's slightly more representative of originals than the synthetic is. The synthetic is slightly more towards the safety side, although it's within a historical norm for the balance. Yeah, there we go. So the grip shape is based on originals, the guard shape is as well. It's a really comfortable, nice grip to use, and it's large enough to get a decent glove in. And when I say a decent glove, Red Dragon is a medium glove, and I don't consider that good enough for this kind of hilt, even though I've kind of got away with it. But I also use the sparring glove, the Polish company's sparring glove, 5-finger special glove, I think they call it. I also use that in this hilt as well, and that works fine. So there's enough space for that. And right, at this stage, I'm going to move straight onto the production model because that's the one you're really going to want to know about. So what it came down to with the prototype, I tested that prototype for maybe 5 months of heavy, heavy use, and overall it was excellent. The only negative really about it is the blade did take quite a set, and Black Fencer told me that the production ones were going to be just a little bit harder, which should stop them taking the set so badly and be slightly tougher on the edges as well. So moving on to the production version, I didn't give any recommendations for how it should be changed because actually they matched the specification on the prototype exactly as I wanted it, and the only thing I did say is we don't necessarily need these ears here because the ears weren't on infantry swords as a rule anyway. Back straps usually were, but it's really not that big a deal whether you have a back strap. It's very much for show, particularly with this kind of sabre. So they will still put a back strap on there for extra as a custom for you if you really, really want it. I don't think it's necessary, but if you really want it, they will do it. So they've simplified that slightly. The grip is now like a heat shrunk rubber type, so it's very, very hard wearing. The shape is still nice original grip shape. Nice and wide and ergonomically formed, exactly like the originals. That's really, really nice. The guard is as it was before. So what has changed on this? Well, realistically, apart from the customization that I've had done, as you can see here, I'll talk about that in a minute. The only thing that's really changed on this is the overall fit and finish is improved. They've machined it better, they've got new equipment to do the fuller, so it's smarter. It's just a nicer product. And let's not forget that these aren't, Black Fencer, they're not a sort of artisan swordsmith. Black Fencer is a synthetic sword manufacturer that has gone into making steel training swords. So don't expect a 500-600 euro custom piece because it's not custom and you're not paying 500 to 600 euros. This is a 260 euro sword, so that's particularly for this type of sword. It's in the sort of Brugeni, this really sort of affordable price range. So it's not an expensive custom. And yet, it looks really nice. It's not quite to that sort of expensive custom range, but it looks way nicer than some of the primitive stuff that you see out there. I mean, some HEMA swords, particularly in the 200 to 300 range, look really, really kind of industrial, and this doesn't. It looks really, really smart, and really nice. It looks incredibly close to a lot of originals in many ways, actually. So, as I said, it hasn't changed much over the original. They do say it's slightly harder. The flexibility, it flexes quite a lot. In fact, it has slightly better flex than the synthetic that they sell, which is quite nice. And they do say because of the hardness, it'll take slightly less edge wear, which it did take a little bit of edge wear on the last one, on the prototype, not terribly. It was slightly softer than a Regeni, for example, which is kind of the standard, if you like, which is because Regeni blades are really hard. And also it should return true better because of that hardness, they say, whereas the last one did take that set from a very hard thrust. So we'll see that in time. I've only sparred with this for one fight, so we're going to have to give a follow-up review in the future. This is just a first impressions plus the 5 months I had with the prototype. Okay, so what else is there to say about this? The tip. A lot of people ask about the tip of the sword. In photos it looks like they've just had a blunt tip on it, kind of reenactment style. That's not what is on there at all. Actually, the blade, in terms of taper, distal taper, it has distal taper down to the tip, and then it flares back out in the opposite direction to widen at the tip. So it does actually flare out. Now, is that enough for you? You're going to have to decide that yourself, because there's no accepted standard in terms of thickness of tips. I think that's pretty decent for this kind of sword, particularly combined with the flexibility. And it's in line with a lot of side swords, for example, that I commonly use. If you feel like you really wanted to put an extra tip on there, of course you could, no problem. But it is quite nice. It does flare out, and it is quite nice. What else is there? Okay, this here, For My Country and King, which is on both sides of the blade. This is a new service that Black Fencer is looking at adding, and they're quite reasonable. I won't talk about pricing because I'll leave that to them, but it's quite reasonable the cost they're going to do for it. But this is the first test one they did, and I got them to stick that on there because that's something you're going to see commonly, or relatively commonly on a lot of, relatively commonly on a small number of British swords in the Napoleonic period. And it is exactly worded like that, For My Country and King. And I pointed them to a font that matches the 18th century style exactly, and that's the font that I use for all the Roth-based stuff. So it looks as close to the originals as you're going to get. Now, blades of this kind, they were often kind of heavily blue and gilded and done up really lavishly. Obviously, we're not going to expect that, but that just gives a bit of flavour for the period, and I think it's just a nice touch. It's a nice bit of customization, and of course, they could put anything you want on there. So people are clearly going to be experimenting a lot with that very soon, but I think it's a nice personal touch, especially when this is a production sword, and with so many people at training, our Bristol training sessions are usually 30 people, loads of them with matching gear. It's really nice to have something that's a bit custom that you don't have to start modifying to match, to try and match it to you personally. You can just get them to do it and have something special to begin with. But anyway, that's purely cosmetic. So, going back to it as a training sword. This one weighs 724 grams. I did get another one when I ordered this one for one of my students, and that weighed 730, so there's 6 grams between them, which is a very small margin between the two, which is excellent. The balance is at just over 14 centimeters, maybe ranged up to 14 and a half, so within a good range, good historical range. British Infantry Sabers, you'd expect anywhere between 10 and 16, so 14 and a half. 10 is a bit far back, there are a few like that. But certainly at this size, you'd expect something in the region of maybe 12 to 16 then, and this is a 14 and a half, so that's a really good balance point. The grip, so this rubbery grip, so far, the sort of heat shrunk type sort of stuff, so far seems really good. It looks smart, and it seems to grip fine, and the shape is still quite nice. And okay, so are there any negatives to it? Any negatives at all? Well, a stirrup hilt saber, the one limitation with them is that the gloves for this kind of sword are really not quite up to standard yet. There are things that you can use. You can use the Koning glove. You could use the 5-finger sparring glove like I use. That's what I used on Wednesday night with this saber. They fit in it and they work. I'm not especially happy with them. They do the job, but we need something better. and I'm sure that will come in time because HEMA products are developing at a hell of a rate. But there are gloves that work for now. You can use things like Red Dragon for light contact, and you can use the other heavy gloves for heavier contact with these, and they'll work fine. And some mittens like the Sabre mittens or Spez mittens, if you really feel like you can get away with that. I don't particularly like mittens for this kind of sword, but it works. But there are there are gloves that currently work for this, and I'm sure we'll get better in time. The style is great. It's just so typically British of the time, which is fantastic. And the blade profile, realistically, most of the other manufacturers I've dealt with have not managed to get this nice wide profile, which is so typical of the era. And they've managed to pull it off nicely whilst not having too much mass in the tip. So, I mean, this is a much more forgiving sword than, for example, the Regeni Polish Saber, which is very stiff and hits very hard. This is very forgiving compared to that. How is it compared to what else is on the market? Well, it's in line with actually a lot of ball-hilt sabers, so it doesn't hit excessively, maybe slightly more than some of them. It depends which one you're comparing them to. Like the Regeni ball-hilts are a bit tankish, but maybe compare this to a Kaviken ball-hilt, it hits about the same. And in terms of flexibility, this actually flexes more than most that are on the market. So yeah, any negative points? Well, I brought up the glove issue. Flexibility, it does flex obviously along the length to a degree, so sometimes people prefer to have it in the tip, but actually I haven't found it to be a problem whatsoever. I've sparred with these a lot now, and the flexibility I find really, really nice. They don't have any problems in actual parrying, and they do flex really nicely when you actually land those thrusts. So really, really like it. Last thing I suppose is the edge damage. I did mention earlier, the last one took a bit of edge damage, not terribly, not like my swordsmithy that just chewed up to pieces. They took a little bit more, maybe Malleus level, so, because Regeni's really hard, maybe they're at the Malleus level. And this one so far seems at least as good, maybe a bit tougher, and you think that's had heavy contact and I can run my hand along it, I haven't filed it or anything like that. So that's promising, and it faced up against the other one of these, so it was facing a decent meaty saber. I don't know what else there is to say about them other than I, so far, absolutely love these, with the only caveat being I really wish we had gloves that were just slightly better for the job, but we've got stuff that we can work with, and these were based on antiques that I own and others that I've handled. They do handle, they look, and they feel like a range of original British Infantry Sabres. The price is really excellent, and so far durability of Black Fencer steel stuff has been really good. So I'm going to have to do a follow-up review in maybe 3 months. That's probably maybe 2 or 3 months. That's a good amount of time to get through, and see how they go then. And I will be taking all of these to the event on the north of England in early March, which is Kings of the North, which is dedicated to British military swordsmanship. So I'll be taking all these there, and lots of people can try them and have a look, and we'll see how they go. But yeah, so far, absolutely love them. They're already now available. This one is now available, released maybe 2 weeks ago to purchase. So if you want to get one now, you can go onto the website and buy one. I don't make any money off that whatsoever. I said I have no commercial affiliation with Black Fencer. My only interest in working with Black Fencer is that we get the best product possible, because in the AHF we've got about 100 members, and I want to get the best products and the best gear in there that we possibly can. And British Military Sabre has been lacking for a long time, and now we're kind of spoilt for choice. I mean, if we could just get a nice steel spadroon, we'd be away. So, if you have any more questions, because I'm sure you will, I'm sure I've forgotten something, but if you have any more questions, please post it in the comment section. I will check it regularly. But absolutely loving these, and it's fascinating and absolutely fantastic to finally have an infantry stirrup-hilted sabre that does the job, is affordable, and looks so awesome. So yeah, there you go. British Military Sabre, British Infantry Sabre of the Napoleonic period. I think it's really been nailed here for the first time in a training sword, and I absolutely love it. And it might seem over the top, but that's how I've been feeling about it for the last few months, ever since using the prototype. I just haven't been able to come on here and tell you about it. So there you go. Absolutely fantastic, highly recommend them, and I will follow up review this as I use it more. And also look out for sparring videos, because I will post sparring videos up in the next few weeks. So thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so, and any questions, put them in the comments below.